Chapter 4, Section 6 is going to be broken up into two parts. This first part, we're just going to talk about how to solve absolute value equations. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to solve equations with absolute values. So let's remember what an absolute value is. This was from Chapter 2, and it says that the absolute value of a number is its distance from 0 on a number line. Both -3 and +3 are 3 units away from 0, so that means both of them have an absolute value of 3. And we write the absolute value with these bars on either side. So whenever you see those, you should be thinking in your head, how far away from 0 is this number? So some problems that we had done before. If you see this, you should be asking yourself, 12 is how many units away from 0 on the number line? Well, it's 12 spaces, so the absolute value of 12 is 12. Absolute value of -2/3. -2/3 is 2/3 from 0 on a number line, so that's why it's positive. And then the absolute value of 0 is kind of a weird one. Since 0 is at 0, it's 0 spaces away. That's your answer. So for all of these questions down here, your answer should be that many spaces. So when we see this one, the absolute value of 5, you should think to yourself, how many spaces away from 0 is 5? Well, it's 5 spaces away. So how about -4? How many spaces away from 0 is -4 on the number line? Well, 4 spaces. About -3.7. It is 3.7 spaces away from 0. And 5/7 is 5/7 spaces away from 0. So now the thing that everyone wants to say is it's always positive, and that's true because it is talking about distance. So absolute value measures distance, and distance cannot be negative. So it has to be something greater than or equal to 0. So we're going to graph some absolute values and now talk about absolute value equations. So an equation, remember, is something that has an equal sign, and we're going to be solving. So we're going to have some unknown, something like x that we don't know what it is. So recall that an absolute value of a number is its distance away from 0 on a number line. Since this absolute value represents distance, it can never be negative. We just went over that. But now we have this equation. The absolute value of x equals 3. Now what that means is some number's distance is 3 spaces from 0. So stop and think about that. You had two options. +3 is 3 spaces away from 0, but then so is -3. So for this answer, we have two solutions. The two solutions are +3 and -3 because their distances are both 3. So what we're going to do is use the properties of equality, like if you add something to one side, you have to add it to the other, to solve an absolute value equation. So I have an example for you up here that's already done. If I wanted to solve this, remember we're trying to get x by itself. So we need to get rid of this +5. So we subtracted 5 from both sides and we simplified. So we get that the absolute value of x is 6. And remember what this means. It means that there's some number whose distance is 6 spaces away from 0. And our two options are 6 and -6. So let's do this next one. Absolute value of t minus 2 equals -1. So I got to get the absolute value by itself. So I'll add 2 to both sides. So I get the absolute value of t equals 1. Now remember, this is asking me what number's distance is 1 space away from 0. And my two answers are t could be 1 or t could be -1. So now for the next one, remember we're using properties of equality. So this says 3 times the absolute value of n equals 15. So to undo that multiplication, I'm going to divide. And I get the absolute value of some number is 5. So stop and ask yourself, what numbers are 5 spaces away from 0? And they are 5 or -5. Now this one's a little more work. We got two things going on here, but pretend that this was your equation. What would you do first? Well, hopefully you said add 2 to both sides. So we end up with 6 equals 3 times the absolute value of w. And now this looks just like the last one we did. We got to get the absolute value by itself. So divide by 3. So I get 2 equals the absolute value of w. Now to find the answer, I want to know what two numbers are 2 spaces away from 0. And it's 2 or negative 2. D is super duper important. Is there a solution to this equation right here? So if I gave you this equation and told you to solve, first thing we gotta do is divide both sides by 2, and we get the absolute value of n is negative 7.5. So remember, this is asking us what numbers are negative 7.5 spaces away from 0. And this cannot happen because you can't have negative distance. There is a negative 0.75, and it's to the left of 0, but you can't have that many spaces away from 0. So there is not a solution to this. So let's do ones that are a little harder. So some absolute value equations will look like this, where we have stuff on the inside of the absolute value. So because of that, we have to use this rule. It says to solve an equation in the form the absolute value of a equals b, where a is a variable expression. So that means this is lots of stuff. Remember the ones that we just did? There was only one letter inside of all of these. Now we're going to have lots of stuff in there. What we can do is we can split this up into 2 equations, and we can solve it when this is a positive number and when this is a negative number. And remember, that's because we're asking ourselves what things are that many spaces away from 0. So this problem that's up here, if we were to set this up, we would solve 2 different equations. We would solve 2p plus 5 equals 11, because that's 11 spaces away from 0. And we would solve 2p plus 5 equals negative 11, because that's also 11 spaces away from 0. So let's do a problem. So now we have lots of stuff inside here. So when we look at this, we say some number minus 2 is 6 spaces away from 0 on a number line. So we need to split this up, because there's 2 options here that are 6 spaces away from 0. We could either have all of this stuff at 6, or we could have this stuff at negative 6. But either way, both of them will be 6 spaces away from 0. So then we just have to solve. And this is kind of like the compound inequalities. You're just solving 2 different equations, and you're going to get 2 different answers. And then these are your 2 possibilities. C could be 8, or C could be negative 4. And with these, the awesome thing is we can check our solution. So let's plug it in. If I plug in 8, I'll get 8 minus 2, take the absolute value. I want to know if that equals 6. So 8 minus 2 is 6. Remember, the absolute value bars are saying how many spaces away from 0 is 6, and it's 6 spaces. Now this one, if we plug in negative 4, we end up with negative 6. And remember, this is asking us how many spaces away from 0 is negative 6, and it's 6 spaces. Skip that one. Let's do the next one. So remember, we're saying that this stuff in here is 14 spaces away from 0 on the number line. So there's 2 options here. That 7D could be at positive 14, or it could be at negative 14. Both of those are 14 spaces away from 0. And then all we got to do is solve. So we get D can be 2, or D can be negative 2. And then remember, you can plug this in. 7 times 2 gives me 14, and 14 is 14 spaces away from 0. 7 times negative 2 gives me negative 14, and negative 14 is 14 spaces away from 0. So that's it for today. You should be able to solve equations with absolute values. So I gave you an easier one and a harder one. Prove to me that you can do both of them. Make sure you write down any questions you have, and we can go over them in class tomorrow. Have a good night.